take chickens, for example. They're what's considered the most efficient converter of crops into meat. You feed about 100 calories of grain, you get about 12 calories back in chicken. So being the most efficient, that's still not very efficient. You're losing almost 90% of the calories there. And the story's not much better for protein if you're looking at that figure as well.
Yeah. Nicholas, pleasure to connect after many exchanged Instagram messages. Great to speak to you. How are you doing?
Doing great. Yeah, great to speak with you too.
Great. So for those that don't know, and we'll go through this part first to give context for what we're going to talk about. Can you explain a little bit about your background, credentials, and the work that you do?
Happy to, yes. So my initial background when it comes to the environment started out in renewable energy and ways in which we can decarbonize our energy system. This started in early in my master's program, and it wasn't until about a course or two in where I looked at a couple of case studies as it relates to food in the environment that I ultimately just felt like a hypocrite. I felt like eating the typical Western American diet. It seemed like that was a very missed opportunity, major impacts, and I shifted all my work around then to food systems issues, solutions, what we need to do. And work-wise, I've worked for a number of different conservation organizations, Nature Canada, different conservation councils, and then a climate change center Canadian-wide where I'm located. And more specifically, in the last few years, it's been all specific to ways in which we can shift to plant-based diets and outlining all the science I can, which there's an abundance of, to why we need to do that. So, and I'm doing that through a few different avenues. One is plantbaseddata.org, where we're just kind of compiling a massive database of scientific literature. And then more recently in a role specifically with the Game Changers Institute, working on a film to bring people on board with this solution.
Amazing. Yes, it's amazing work, and I regularly share your posts because it's just such good information. And it's scientifically backed. There's data there to support the points that are made. So when we think about diet, what is wrong with the way that we currently on a global level? We pretty much now, most of us eat in a similar way. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, so what's happening is the typical Western diet is being exported globally, and it's going to continue to do so unless we do something about that. And what that is meat and dairy are the center of the plate, and what that means for ecosystems and farmland is essentially this. We've converted about half of the habitable planet to farms, and it's not equally to all farms. About 80 to 83% of all farmland is for animal agriculture and fish farming, so feed for farmed fish now. And what that mostly looks like is a story of two main things: a huge amount of the planet for grazing, so for grazing cattle who typically will end up on a feedlot, and as well for dairy, but also for feed crops. So huge amounts of the world are dedicated solely to growing crops that are then fed to confined animals. Take a look at soy, for example. Over 80% of all soy goes to feed animals that then end up as meat. And when I kind of was aware of all this stuff, one, I'm like, well, how did I not know about this before? It seems like such a huge stat, such a huge amount of the planet that is shocking to me. And I feel like for most people that maybe hear that for the first time, it might be a bit of a surprise, because you just kind of maybe drive out to a countryside, no matter where you're in the world, and you see some kind of lush farmland. It doesn't look like it's too impactful, but a big part of this industry is kind of around secrecy and kind of relying on that kind of pastoral setting and look. But ultimately, the story is turning wild ecosystems and native wild animals and converting that into farmland. So that's essentially what's happened around the world. And the damaging part now is as countries and societies become richer, typically they consume a bit more meat and dairy. That's at least been the trend in the past. and we need to change that. We need to find ways to skip that. We need to first address in these these rich countries that are consuming the most and responsible for the most, but then find ways to shift to plant based through making it more accessible, making it more cool and friendly and amazing, because it is.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. I think there's a number of avenues to discuss there, and it's not just as you said the land use either for grazing or for growing crops. We have to think about the water use that's involved there, the use of antibiotics with animals. All these things increase as consumption increases. Um, you said about, it was interesting. You said about soy, for example. I think one of the other issues with soy is that a lot of the areas where soy is grown, it's not a native crop to those lands, and that has its own adverse effect on those ecosystems. Can you speak a little bit about soy in particular and what's happening? Because for many people, I think they believe that it's the vegans that are eating all this soy, and we're eating so much tofu. We're clearing the Amazon to feed vegans, but it's just not the case.
Yeah, soy is become one of the most polarizing topics, nutrition wise, but also environment wise too. I mean, just first for a high level stat, 6% of all soy is for human consumption. So very, very little. And of course, soy is consumed for human consumption quite a bit across the world, but
Yeah,
that's not what, is deforesting the Amazon. Take the Cerrado region of the Amazon. That is the area where there's the most soy coming out of. Most of that is going towards confined animals, mostly chickens and pigs in the EU and China. And soy in itself is not a damaging crop. Soy can be grown as a part of a, if you want to call it regenerative plant agricultural system, whatever kind of buzzword you want to use for it. It's a nitrogen fixing crop. While it's not native to many areas, it can be grown in a very eco-friendly way. That's a way to allow ecosystems, biodiversity to flourish. So any discussion of kind of creating a regenerative agricultural system, to me, should mean uh, allowing as best as possible to grow a good amount of food sustainably on a low amount of land. Using half of all the habitable planet for farming does not sound regenerative to me. Now, what's kind of like happened with that term, which of course everyone defines it kind of differently, but it's certainly being co-opted by animal agricultural industry to, delay change, delay shift away. That's one of their main methods right now of doing that. But I think an important kind of study to look at that would be the United States, for example, had a study from researchers from Boston University and Harvard, and they looked at what happened to the food supply of beef if we shifted from kind of the typical pastoral and feedlot setting where they live about a year and a half, and then they're fattened up quickly on a feedlot before going to slaughter, to instead a grass finished system. And this isn't typically a regenerative agricultural type system, but it's just finishing it on grass. And what happens is it uses 270% more land in the US and actually produces less food. And what the kind of theory of change is with regenerative agriculture is, adding some crops to that system as well. Some good things like cover crops, using compost, not tilling or low tilling amount of land, so not stirring up the soil too much. All those things I support. I think those are great. But a big part of that is integrating cattle. And as soon as you do that with the other system as well, there's been studies that showed you're using even 2.5 times more land than a typical grass finish system. So if someone wants to kind of support this regenerative ranching type system for whatever reason, there is some trade-offs. There is some things that might be slightly better, like, it's less damaging than super intensive grazing.
sure.
So say someone wants to kind of integrate that, you need to at least acknowledge that we need a major shift plant-based. And of course, everyone has different perspectives when it comes to food. Food is cultural. Food is intertwined in, who we are and how we see ourselves. So I totally get that not everyone's going to be on board with some exclusive plant-based, theory of change. But we have basic biophysics involved here. We have basic planetary systems that we need to consider. So, I'll take people seriously and discuss it when they first acknowledge we need to shift to plant-based, but that's just not what's happening. And even the top kind of academics working in what would be called animal science and advocating for regenerative agriculture. They won't even acknowledge that, and they can't. And a lot of the time, that's because their funding relies on it, so they can't admit that we need to shift away from animal agriculture.
Yeah, I think it's such a nuanced issue, isn't it? Where a lot of the funding for these studies and for these academics is coming from the very industries that stand to benefit from the outcome of their findings if they're positioned in a certain way. And data is very easy to manipulate data to reach an outcome that corresponds with the people that are funding the study. Um, you touched on briefly earlier with oceans, and I think it's something that's very, it's kind of left as the thing discussed last. We had Cowspiracy first of all. We later followed that with Seaspiracy, which was a real eye-opening documentary for what's going on in the oceans. One of the things that I was really interested to discover was just the amount of dead zone space in the ocean and the direct consequence of the runoff from different herbicides and pesticides that were sprayed into fields that would then go into rivers that would then go into oceans. So there is this connection between farming on land and ocean dead zones. It's not just directly fishing. Can you speak a little bit to kind of what's happening in the oceans at the moment and what potentially could happen to fish populations and marine wildlife?
Yeah, there's some real sketchy stuff happening in terms of monitoring what they'd call fish stocks in the ocean. And, the way in which they essentially have kind of defined the metrics would be underfished, overfished, or sustainably fished. And, looking into that and learning from many others that have, been more in depth into the ocean science than I have, it's very clear that most of the ocean is there for commercial gain to us. And there was a stat from the Intergovernmental Panel or Platform on Biodiversity, IPBES is a report. Then there's quite a good report on that specific to fishing. And they show that 55% of the sea floor is affected by industrial fishing. And 66% of the global marine environment has been altered by human actions. So, of course, there's many factors that have kind of shifted our issues in the ocean, namely climate change, plastic pollution as well, something that is deeply concerning. But by far the biggest issue we're dealing with the ocean is fishing. And, the industry there is hiding behind these kind of claims that that fishing is required for low resource areas of the world or poorer populations. But the reality is that industrial fishing as we have it is the biggest effect on areas that rely on fishing for subsistence. So it's not a good argument, and it's something that's, again, just used to kind of delay shifts and change. Ultimately, we need to restore and rewild our oceans, just like we do on land with rewilding at least some of the land that we're using for farmland. And there are organizations doing that. There are organizations and movements of lots of young people that are looking to restore corals and grow seaweed, and not just grow seaweed for commercial use, but actually restore some of it to the ocean floor. So I think there's lots of solutions to be found in this space. I think we just need a movement of people that care a bit more about this, that get fired up and advocate and educate others about this. And I mean, there needs to be government and policy changes as well, because ultimately the whole world relies on a healthy ocean, and it's only after it's too late that we'll realize, okay, we haven't been treating this too well, and it's going to be harder and harder in the end to adjust once the damage is done.
I think there's a few issues with the consciousness that sits behind a lot of decisions that we make culturally. One is that we think of things in isolation. We don't look at things as being symbiotic, right? We don't look at the relationship between, the oceans and the animals and the land, and we don't think of things in tandem. We think of things as very isolated pockets. And I think we also have this kind of individualist ownership-based culture where we can own things. It's not that we're stewards of things, that we're there to take care of things. It's that things are ours. And then this causes us to think in these very short-term perspectives, right? And so we only think of things as far as we can see them, and these are commodities to be exploited and to be profited from. not that potentially at some point can run out. If you look at fish in the ocean, I know that the quote that's very often repeated is 2050 is as soon as 2050 to see fish as oceans. And so I really think it's a cultural mindset shift that needs to happen about how we think about the planet and the various things that we look at in isolation, how we marry those together and bring those back together to look at it as an ecosystem, not as is these kind of isolated things. It's really really quite frustrating when you have those types of conversations.
And like, what a difficult thing, honestly. Like, this is
Yeah,
like,
sure.
we have these high level stats. We have everyone kind of living out their lives in different areas of the world. It's easiest right now to consume more and kind of be a part of the social norm than it is to go against it.
Absolutely.
And yet we can look at some not too far, recent history. Part of where I'm in the world, in an area called Newfoundland in eastern Canada. This area had the collapse of the cod fishery in the 90s, and it was based on a similar tracking system of monitoring the fish stocks, you could say, in that area. But they just were not keeping good enough track on it. And this was also a time where there was a lot of innovation and technology in terms of trawlers. So small boats that could go out there with major trawling nets and just empty areas of the ocean. And sure enough, the whole fisheries there collapsed, and the amount of turmoil in that case, the government's needing to make decisions. Okay, now it's actually banned to go out and do this. We need the population to recover, and all these people that are affected by this too, right? So I think the more we're able to be a bit more proactive about some of these things, incentivize those that are in that, educate. It takes all kinds of different solutions,
Of course.
but ultimately, like, the end result will be far worse than any sort of like upsetting little policy that might prevent the worst case scenarios. So I mean, I just think that we need to address these things now, otherwise the outcome in the end will be far more upsetting to lots of people.
We're not completely removed. I mean, people love to quote when it comes to kind of when you're encouraging the adoption of a more plant-based diet, people love to reference history to reinforce their view, right? Oh, we've always eaten meat, we've always done this. In actual fact, if you look at the historical record, the consumption of meat today is far higher than it's ever been, owing to its availability. It was maybe something that in our grandparents' generation you had a few times a week, especially with beef, right? Maybe it was once a week or twice a week. It certainly wasn't for $4 at a McDonald's every morning on the way to work. And so I think it's about reframing our relationship with food. It's obvious from a health perspective, the outcomes that we're seeing now as it relates to heart disease, diabetes, and what this standard Western diet is doing from a health perspective. And we're also starting to realize what it's doing from a planetary perspective. But I think it's the last thing from natural. We can't argue that the way that we eat currently is natural. We also can't argue that the way that we raise animals is anywhere close to natural. We were given this vision of the cows in the fields grazing and the farmer looking after the cows, but this is far from a natural for a natural ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, like in the 60s, there was still, actually in the 1960s, there was a lot of animals being farmed, about 8 billion. But, just in that time since then, there's now over 80 billion land animals and, probably over a trillion fish if you count them, but they're not even counting them by individual fish. It's more by tons. So, what we've done in that amount of time far exceeds even population growth, and it's not slowing down. Certainly, there's some shifts happening in terms of what animal foods people are consuming. People are typically consuming a bit less beef in some rich countries and shifting more to chicken. But that's not a good switch. It really isn't, because there's a trade-off of environmental issues when you look at chicken. There's 70 billion or so chickens that are farmed right now yearly, and they're one of the biggest consumers of feed crops. And probably a bigger issue even than the environmental considerations there would be the risk of antibacterial resistance and even risk of pandemics. It'd probably be highest when it comes to chicken farming. So, there's not perfect solutions there, but we ultimately need to give plant-based a try over just small little shifts in what people are eating for meat.
I promise we'll stop riffing on the problems in a minute and switch to the solutions. But just so if we can touch on quickly antibiotic resistance and the potential threat that poses with the volume of antibiotics. Do you have any numbers around the amount of antibiotics in circulation or the percentage and what the risk might be with that?
Yeah, I can't remember the stat right now, but it is the biggest consumer of antibiotics in the world is farmed animals. I know that much to say for certain. And what's happening there is the more you're using antibiotics, the less of effect they have, and that can translate over to humans as well. So there could be a period in the future where antibiotics just don't work anymore.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
a quick Google search of that, you can find all kinds of resources that unfortunately are a tough read. But this is what we're doing with this type of farming system. So the risk of that happening, even if it's a small risk, which I think is actually pretty high, but even if it's a small risk, it's still enough to look at other options.
sure. I think to touch on as well, comes to mind as you mentioned the trawlers, the amount of waste that we see at the moment as well is really quite staggering. Not that it's enough to grow or to raise the volume of meat for food that we currently do. The amount of food waste that we experience as well, both in terms of fishing, in terms of vegetables, crops, etc., but also in terms of animal protein, is really quite staggering. I saw a statistic recently relating to the UK, and it was as high as 40% of food is actually goes to waste, and it's really quite shocking that all of that resource and all of that energy goes into to growing food or raising food, and it's just discarded because of the I guess the system that brings it to the people.
Yeah, it's wild. It really is. There's so much waste, and something that I've seen less mentioned. I mean, there is pretty good support to address food waste. Not that it's happening at a grand scale, but there's pretty good widespread support that we need to waste less food. Um, but the biggest source of food waste is the amount of crops that we grow and feed to animals. And the reason why that's the case, and it's not factored into that kind of typical 30 or 40% global food waste number. Typically, what that number would come from would be, post-consumer waste, even retail waste. There's tons of food that's wasted, and there's things we can do to help that. Even just composting more, I think, would be a very beneficial thing, and not like it's all on the individual, but we can have municipal, citywide composting that can help there. But take chickens for example. They're what's considered the most efficient converter of crops into meat. You feed about 100 calories of grain, you get about 12 calories back in chicken. So, being the most efficient, that's still not very efficient. You're losing almost 90% of the calories there. And the story's not much better for protein if you're looking at that figure as well.
Yeah,
So, yeah, that's the biggest source of waste in doing that. And then, even when you're looking at the post consumer waste, uh, when you're wasting meat in the end, you have all that back end that goes into it. But also when you look at what actually gets wasted the most in terms of food spoilage and just the need to store it a bit more carefully, there's far more meat being wasted even than there is plants. So it's an issue, and ultimately it can be addressed by a number of different ways. I think there's lots of different organizations and even cities on the local scale that are trying to address this food waste issue. But I would like to see people look at the demand and production side shift of diets to help reduce waste as well.
absolutely. I think if we can almost, as I understand it, and we'll put it like this. So presently, most of the world now, in fact, at least the Western world, the developed world, as you would say, consume a standard Western diet where they're consuming meat and dairy with most of their meals. The issue with meat and dairy is that we have to put our calories through a middleman, right? The only way that these animals grow is they have to consume crops that we could otherwise consume, but they go via the animal. In raising that animal, we also have land use, we have water use, we have um, the hormones, and everything else that we've not even touched on to produce calories which otherwise could have gone directly to the human if the food choice was different in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's methane as well. So, looking at climate change, it's the most known environmental issue we have. I think there's other as dire issues like biodiversity loss and land use
Sure.
concerns. But looking specifically at climate change, 32% of all methane comes from cattle alone. So
Wow.
not factoring in the manure and waste of other animal agriculture as a whole. But yeah, 32% comes from cows specifically, and that's mostly through something called enteric fermentation. So just in the way their guts work with as being a ruminant, that they'll consume some grass or consume some grain, and then that will react with their stomach and produce out methane, which now you can actually see it over top of feedlots from space. There's all these new satellites that are going up and measuring and tracking methane as it's observed from space, and showing that over dairy feedlots in particular, there's a major contributing factor from methane. And on a positive note, the thing about methane is it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. CO2, carbon dioxide, that's the biggest focus of climate change, and for good reason to some extent. It is longer lasting. It'll be in the atmosphere for about 100 years or more when it's emitted. But methane is about 80 times stronger than CO2 over about 20 years. So in the decade or two that it's in the atmosphere, it's very strong. But if we reduce all methane now, and we can reduce methane by reducing herd sizes, reducing the amount of beef that people consume, reduce the amount of cattle that are farmed, but also looking at natural gas, fossil fuels as a whole is also a big contributor to methane. Then we'll see those atmospheric positive effects in a decade or two if we address that. So I think, in terms of like addressing the climate change issues we're seeing today, the drought, the heat, the increased storms, methane is the best lever we can pull and address right now to at least buy us some time to decarbonize our energy system and deal with the other things too.
For many people, it's difficult to comprehend, but for me, what made it very apparent was when, because we can talk about these statistics and scale, but for many people, 100,000 is no different to a million. It's very difficult to visualize these numbers and the scale of what's going on, and to think beyond the immediate area where we live, to think on a planetary basis, is very difficult for the human mind to process. But if you think about, and I think of myself maybe 10 years ago when I used to eat animal products, the amount of animals required for me to eat the diet that I'm eating every week would probably be 30 plus. Probably 30 plus, if not more, right? If I'm eating an animal product twice a day, let's say I'm having some cheese in the morning, I'm having, some chicken and some milk at lunchtime. And in the evening, I'm having butter, I'm having steak, I'm having something else. Over the course of a week, that's a large number of animals that have had to have been raised, fed, transported, put into the supermarket. That's a large amount of animals. Then if you extrapolate that out for the number of people that are eating in that way, you start to get a sense of just how many animals are on the planet at one time in relation to how many humans there are, and how out of sync that is with a natural ecosystem and the way that Earth has always been. And it really puts it into perspective just how much damage we are doing, and how out of sync that is with perhaps how things are supposed to be. And it's only been the recent history that we've got to this point, which gives me hope that actually we have an opportunity now with this growing awareness that we can start to shift the other way. So what I would say to you is that, as an individual that's maybe starting to become aware of some of these issues, and it seemed kind of overwhelming, it seemed that it's a problem that's getting worse. What are some of the we'll talk about larger actions, but on an individual basis, what's the most impactful things that we can do as individuals to start to bring about some form of change?
Yeah, I mean, food wise, specifically, I think we should be looking at shifting as much plant based as possible. And, individually, that can be a big task. That can be a, behavioral change over time for anything is difficult. And then when it comes to food, there's ingrained things of family, culture, traditions. I think, and maybe we can talk a bit more of that, but I think there's a role in, plant-based alternatives mimicking the taste and texture and, love people have of food. And I think that's very important. And, outside of food, though, I think there's many things that individuals can do. If you're looking at just food, though, about 20 to 40% of your individual footprint would come specifically from food. And that's how much you'd reduce it if you're shifting to plant-based. So, I mean, that's kind of empowering. You can do quite a bit if you can kind of get around that. And, you don't need to be perfect, but if you can try it out and give that a real shot, that is people I think have more autonomy to do that than it is to change their, say, energy systems. And I mean, at least that's how I felt at that time. You know, when I was first looking at, okay, all the different actions that I'm doing that might be contributing harm, what are some things that I can change? And energy system was not one that I had much control over back then, or even now. It's not financially accessible to most. It has gotten, even in the last 6, 7, 8 years, it's gotten way better. Solar panels, of course, have come way down in cost, and I think there's you know, certainly ways to do this depending on where you're in the world that make economic sense. But certainly, you know, mostly for energy, it's a bit tougher. But even just like general consumption, like, you know, our plastic footprints are pretty huge. When it comes to shopping, right? Our shopping footprint, fashion, it's pretty massive. I love the new kind of increased cool factor to thrift shopping. I'm all on board with that. I think that's something that can get people to have that kind of shopping fix, but not contributing to all kinds of new products being made all the time. Um, yeah, I think generally outside of those things, I think educating yourself, learning, talking to others in non-judgmental ways about this topic will only help this whole movement progress better. Certainly talking to politicians locally makes sense, to get some advocates, find who those advocates are, and you know, arm them with ways in which they can try to create change. But you know, generally, I think people could just see what they're good at, what they love doing, and there's typically an environmental focus that can be within there.
I think the you know the initial shift is much easier when you don't have to think too much or too differently to what you're currently doing, right? So you're quite right when it comes to meat alternatives. You know, if you eat a spaghetti bolognese every Monday, you swap out a plant-based mince. I mean, the quality now is so good across most brands, you just simply can't tell the difference. The environmental impact is significant. If you're it's a behavior that you're repeating on a day in day out basis, the compounding effect of that and the impact that you're having as an individual is quite huge. Similarly, same with thrift shopping, right? It's like I love that that's becoming cool now. I love the fact that plant-based food is becoming cool now, and it's through that credibility that we'll get more people to adopt these changes. If you were to design a food system, let's say that you know we could put everything on pause right now. We could almost start again in a way. How would you approach that? What would the ideal food system be? Now, I know this is difficult because the world is very different. Areas of the world have different temperatures and requirements and everything. But let's look at perhaps Canada, where you are, or the US, for example. What kind of shift would need to happen to move towards a more regenerative and more a food system that's more in keeping with the way that nature intended?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and I'll do my best to address it. But this is the question. That is the number one thing that we should all be thinking about when it comes to ecosystems, food, what we need to do to help improve that. Uh, Maybe I'll do it by like a national scale, because you know, assuming that there is not global collaboration too much with food, which there should be more. But I think each country should look at areas of their land that are most fertile for agriculture, for plant agriculture. And, you know, we should be growing the most amount of plant crops there in a way that's not overly intensive. I think we can certainly inspire from stock free organic, which is just a way of saying we can grow plant crops without using manure, without using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And we can do that through compost systems. We can do that through not tilling and using cover crops. These are, you know, over long periods of time, this is what's known as conservation agriculture. And there is some areas there where you might lose a little bit of yield, but you're going to have a longer term benefit by not degrading the land. So I think that's what we should be first looking at is, okay, where can we grow the best food? How do we need to help people get there to grow that, whether it's incentives or maybe education to help get those practical skills to grow those specific things, and you know, align markets to make sure that they're able to do that. And then when it comes to all the land used for grazing, all the land used for milk and feed crops, of course, it's not just going to switch overnight. But I think if I'm able to pause on it and find ways to incentivize those growers and landowners to restore the ecosystem that was there before, and also be incentivized for doing that. And that can be large areas of land, or that can be smaller kind of urban rewilding type scenarios. But picture it's the large areas of land. We're able to restore some of the keystone species that have helped that ecosystem thrive before. And when I kind of frame that situation, often people think, okay, well, how are we going to feed the world? But ultimately, there's been scenario after scenario that has looked at this. If we instead divert the amount of crops being grown directly to human consumption, one scenario looked at this from she's now a NASA senior science writer. She looked at this scenario. If we just divert the crops around the world to human consumption, we could feed 4 billion more people, which is more than the 2 to 3 billion coming in the next couple decades. So we grow enough food, and we can actually rewild lots of land too. And then when you're kind of getting that scenario right, then we can look at ways in which we can also reduce fertilizer use. We ultimately don't need manure, but we have an overabundance of manure, so it's just being sprayed out on fields to try to pretend like that's adding fertility to crops. Oftentimes, it's running off into waterways. So we don't need it. We just need to find ways of shifting away from that in ways that are just and fair, and can look at a future that and envision one that is both sustainable for humans, but also wildlife and nature, and can help kind of pull the carbon out of the air. So I think if I could kind of frame it that way, that's where that would be. And you could add, of course, a lot more in terms of municipal planning with compost. I think if we were able to divert a lot of the plant agricultural waste to industrial compost facilities, which is happening around the world already, that could be creating high value soil, which could be used in these kind of super eco-friendly, stock-free organic farms. So that's a bit of a cyclical manner there. You could call it regenerative. I think just the regenerative term is kind of co-opted now, but that is what a regenerative agricultural system looks like. It's certainly not expanding agricultural land and putting more cattle on land.
Incredible. The only things that I'd love your opinion on to add to that, firstly, is sort of individual ownership in terms of reconnecting people to where their food comes from, and allowing for some kind of urban farming, or growing small kind of no dig farms at home, whether that's growing tomatoes on your windowsill if the climate allows, or having a lemon tree, or having some home kind of growing. It's something that I've got into more recently, and it's really helped me to reconnect where food comes from. When you're involved in that process, and even if you're sprouting or you're doing something like this,
Yeah.
and you're caring for these plants as they grow, it gives you this kind of sense of being a lot more careful with how you use food, not throwing it away so easily. You see the work that goes into it. You reconnect to where the food comes from. You have a deeper appreciation for it, and I think that's definitely missing in our culture presently. Food has become very throwaway. It's so abundant that very little important is based on what it is and how it gets there. And the second thing, because it's a point that I'm challenged with all the time, and it's one of the spaces that I work in, is that's great, but where do we get our protein from? We become obsessed with protein, right? And so the model of looking at things like cellular agriculture, converting farms to being cellular agricultural units, what that could look like, precision fermentation, which has an incredible yield based on the amount of resource and land that's needed when it comes to that form of protein. What are your thoughts on kind of technological approaches to protein cultivation and for repurposing farms as they are presently?
Yeah, I love this frame of question because it's looking at kind of the local scale of the benefits of urban farming and perhaps small gardens. And I think that will always have a role in, I don't think that solution is any sort of like feed the world type solution or on a grand scale, but the benefits of it are incredible. Just like you said, you get more connected with it. You know how food is grown. Picture every school having a bit of an urban farm, and that being part of the curriculum and teaching kids right about where food comes from, how to grow it, just invaluable knowledge. And technology, it's certainly not something that I'm overly advocating for, but I can completely see the benefits of let's put them together for now: plant-based alternatives, precision fermentation, cultivated meat. Ultimately, if any or all of these are successful to any major scale and it helps people shift away from animal agriculture, the abundance of opportunities we'll have with land alone, are incredible. It can be, restoring ecosystems. It can be a combination of maybe land back programs for indigenous populations that had their land taken away, often from ranching. It can be just an abundance of different options we can do with land. And with fresh water, we're going to increasingly have drought issues as our planet continues to warm, depending on where you're in the world, of course. But we need to do everything we can to free up fresh water. And food is the number one source of fresh water around the world. So we need to do things that use less of that. So yeah, with plant-based alternatives, that would be what I'm most kind of optimistic about. I think the innovations happening there. When I first went plant-based after kind of being aware of all this, there's very little options available. This was back in 2015, and yeah, since then the industry has taken off, and it's ups and downs. It's still not displacing a whole lot. It's still kind of adding maybe a bit of a new food category instead of fully displacing. I suppose milk would be an exception to that rule. It seems like
Yeah.
plant-based milk are displacing dairy milk to a decent amount so far. But yeah, that'd be what I'm most optimistic about, and I think that will only get better. I think the amount of crops being used in these plant-based alternatives will start to diversify, perhaps more with mushrooms, perhaps more with lentils and other ancient grains as well. Could be something that would help on the environmental side. And on the health side, of course, some of these can be optimized to have less salt and still be very tasty. And, I think there's just an abundance of new options. This seems to be just like the phase one rollout of all this, right? Like it's all going to get much better. And precision fermentation, I'd say that'd be next on my list as like optimistic about, certainly in replacing dairy and, some of these dairy and yogurt products that people are consuming every single day. It seems to be like an animal-free version would make so much more sense, and again, it'd free up so much space for land and reduce greenhouse gases. And with cultivated meat, and let me just preface this: I'm not an expert on the technical side of there, but I've tried to kind of not have too firm of a position for or against it. I have seen some data showing the concerns over scalability. Certainly not enough to not fund it and not give it support. Of course, there's billions and billions of dollars going to animal agriculture, which is just a system that's just doing damage on a mass scale. So, some of that, if not all of it, should be diverted to trying out these new innovations. But I with cultivated meat, I just like to kind of keep in the frame of mind of like, people are still eating fast food, a lot of it. It's probably not going to go away anytime soon. Picture if half of McDonald's meat was replaced with cultivated meat, even in form of maybe hybrid products to make it a bit more achievable. That would be incredible. I think that would be a major first step. I mean, I've never tried cultivated meat. I would try it, but I think there's still a bit of a marketing PR issue with that. Like people are not fully on board with seeing something that's created in a lab, right? There is still that stigma about that. But people don't know where their food's produced either, right? People don't know how their meat got to their table, right? So there's some work there. As much as there's innovation happening there, I'd like to see those companies and supporters of that also describe that. And I think a lot of them are. I think a lot of them are kind of bringing people through, touring their facilities, and seeing how it's produced, which is not something you can do at a slaughterhouse, of course.
Yeah,
So,
there's a lack of information there. I think obviously on a cellular level, the whole point of cellular agriculture is that the products mimic meat on a cellular level. Like it's actually the same thing. In terms of where it comes from, you're not having the hormones, you're not having the various things that are pumped into the animal to get it to that size, right? So, but I do agree with you. I think from a public awareness and public perception perspective, it's not had the best start in terms of its PR and the marketing around it. Whereas precision fermentation, plant-based seems to be getting there. It's, as you say, rightly said, it's probably created a new category as opposed to displacing one. But I think
mm,
the strides that we've made in terms of the product quality and what's available and the availability globally of those products is just amazing. I mean, there's a product here in the UAE that has launched recently that uses a fava bean. That's a local,
mm,
more of a local protein, great tasting, and it's done in the format of the kind of foods that people are used to consuming here, and it's doing very, very well. So think that's the easiest initial shift. We mentioned that it's not been a steady climb with the adoption of plant based, and in recent times it's been a bit of a battle. What do you see as the challenges that this movement will face over the next few years if it's to kind of reach a wider adoption of plant based diets?
If I could sum it up in one word, it's misinformation. It's gotten big enough to understand that this is a concern to a large lobby industry of animal agriculture across the world, that the amount of money and resources and time and individuals working at creating misinformation is massive. And I don't think anyone quite understands the scale of this. I would say they're as big as the misinformation happening around fossil fuels and has happened over decades past. Certainly, same thing with tobacco, the plastics industry. They're no different than in terms of the tactics and resources to misinform on the topic. The difference is with food, you can hide behind this like idyllic pastoral setting, right? You have
Yeah,
that like idea of food being not what it is that you're consuming, not what it actually is, and how it's produced. So I think it's very powerful. I think misinformation, is only increased with social media, of course, and ways in which influencers are paid and not disclosing. Looking at academics, there's in the environmental space when it comes to food, most of the work is happening when it comes to something called animal science. And these are highly paid academic positions, and they're not mostly paid from the university. They're mostly paid from industry. And that's not to say everyone there is, biased, but there's certainly a major amount of industry funding going into academia to create these studies that show, yeah, it shows anything. It shows anything from the environmental health side of why we need to, pump the brakes on shifting away from animal source foods for whatever reason, whether it's food security, greenhouse gases, land. I mean, there's multiple different tactics and ways that can happen. And I mean, it's also reaching a point where, like, the ability to critically decipher between true and not true information is also very difficult these days. It's also very difficult on social media, where a lot of people get, their news information on right now. So it's a bit of a perfect storm to delay this action. I don't think, I think the plant-based movement and, the products being created would have increased a little bit more if it wasn't for all this. And I think it's really just a little bit of a speed bump to then increase more, because ultimately these products will be cheaper. I think they're pretty close in taste. Some of them even, I would say, taste better, but I mean, I'm no expert there, but I think they're pretty close. So the fact that it can taste the same, be a bit cheaper, really what you need to address next is, the social norms and the ways in which, it's normalized to eat plant-based. And certainly when it comes to daycares and schools. There was a recent analysis I did, a bit behind the scenes, but it was looking at all the different schools and childcare facilities in North America that have been offering more plant-based menus. And certainly, the main reason for doing that is not environment related, but typically it's because a plant-based menu would have less allergens, and it would increase fiber, and it would be more inclusive to the different cultures and religions that might limit meat for different reasons. So it's the kind of inclusivity, the cost as well, and increasing fiber, which is kind of creating that demand for that. So I think in doing that, it's only going to normalize this as a solution, and I think that's only going to increase. And no amount of misinformation, I think, will quite be able to go through that, despite all the more attempts that will happen.
Yeah, I think the truth is powerful, right? The truth is
Mm-hmm.
powerful. We're reaching a tipping point where there's some things that just can no longer be denied, and we can see the consequences of these actions evident all around us. And so, really, I think we're going through a shift in people's awareness. We're going through a shift in people's willingness to take action on it. And it's so inspiring to see so many young people getting involved in this movement and really caring about what's going on. And it's thanks, to the kind of stuff that you publish, and we're able to really leverage that. So it's a huge thank you to putting that information out there, because it's really helpful in in backing up the conversations that we're having. For people that want to learn more, where can they find you? You mentioned you have the website. Can you share a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my work is I put most of it out on Instagram and Twitter, or X or whatever it's called now. I'm on Threads as well. I mean, I'm on most of them, so people could find me where then. But I'm probably most active on Instagram and Twitter. Plantbaseddata.org is a resource. We have a bit of a small team that really are just trying to continue to show this scientific consensus and make all those scientific studies open access, but also kind of break it down with summaries and making it more accessible to show that, this isn't like fringe science that's happening here. This is bodies of academic research and data, local and global, that has been happening for decades, advocating that we should be shifting towards this way. And, we have a health folder on there as well as environment, and we have one on pandemics and zoonotic diseases, and a little bit less, but we also have some on economic and policy. So like these different things that can happen there. So, some of my work will continue to be on there as well. And yeah, people can message me anytime too on Twitter and Instagram. That's probably the best way. My email is pretty full, but people can email me too.
Sure. No, well, thank you so much for taking the time. We'll link everything up in the show notes, and super helpful. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.